In the peaceful English countryside, a nursery rhyme is about to become a blueprint for murder. A rich man dies with a handful of rye in his pocket, a shocking echo of singer-song of sixpence. Who would stage a crime with such chilling artistry? Was it a family member, greedy for an inheritance, or a madman playing a deadly game? The police are baffled, but a certain elderly lady with a mind as sharp as a needle sees a pattern no one else can. She knows the next verse is coming, and it promises to be deadlier than the last. Can she solve the puzzle before the final blackbird sings? Chapter 1. The first blackbird the autumn morning at Yew Tree Lodge began with the sort of crisp, golden light that promised a day of peaceful tranquility. Inside, however, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of airstale resentment. The lingering ghost of a family argument and the overwhelming scent of wealth gone sour. Rex Fortescue, a man whose fortune was as vast as his unpopularity, sat at the head of a mahogany breakfast table that felt less like a gathering place and more like a jury box. He was a man who had built his empire on a foundation of sharp deals and sharper words. His face, etched with a lifetime of frowns, was a testament to his belief that the world was a battlefield and every person an opponent. Across from him sat his wife, Adele, a woman half his age, with eyes that held a permanent, practiced sadness. She picked at a piece of toast, her silence a perfect counterpoint to his grumbling. Around them, the silence of the large house was punctuated by the distant, clinking sounds of the staff. "This tea is weak," Rex announced, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate the fine china. "Fetch Gladys to make it again, and tell her to put some effort into it this time." The butler, a perpetually stooped man named Crump, stood by the sideboard like a statue of discretion. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice as thin as old parchment. He moved with a quiet, practiced grace, disappearing through the heavy oak door. Moments later, the young parlour-maid, Gladys, a girl with a nervous tremor in her hands, returned with a fresh pot. She poured the dark liquid, her gaze fixed on the spout, as if afraid to meet Rex's imperious stare. Rex took a long, slow sip. A flicker of something, a strange, bewildered expression, passed over his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket, his hand fumbling for a moment, before his body went rigid. The teacup clattered to the saucer, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. His eyes, wide with a final, terrible surprise, stared at the ceiling as his head hit the polished wood of the table with a dull thud. Adele gasped, a fragile sound that broke the silence. Crump, returning with the morning post, dropped the letters, which fanned out across the oriental rug like a deck of playing cards. Gladys let out a small, terrified whimper, her hand flying to her mouth. The local doctor, a kind but ineffectual man named Hayden, arrived within the hour. He was no stranger to Yew Tree Lodge. Rex Fortescue's heart was a frequent source of complaint, but this was different. Dr. Hayden examined the body, his brow furrowed with professional concern. "A massive coronary," he announced, a pronouncement that seemed to soothe the immediate panic. His heart simply gave out. "I'm not surprised, given his temperament and lifestyle." The family, who had slowly gathered, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. A natural death. It was tragic, of course, but it was tidy. It was something they could process. But as the police arrived, an inspector with a sharp, modern gaze named Neil, the tidy narrative began to fray. Neil was a man of facts and evidence, not of local gossip or family history. He listened patiently to Dr. Hayden, then, With a methodical precision, he began his own examination. His eyes, missing nothing, roamed the room before settling on Rex's body. "What's this?" Neil asked, his voice cutting through the hushed tones of the room. He was holding up a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside, nestled on a square of black velvet, was a handful of grain. "Rye," a constable offered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "A handful of rye," Neil confirmed, his face a mask of professional curiosity. "Found in the deceased's pocket. It's an odd thing to carry around, don't you think?" The family looked at each other, their relief replaced by a fresh wave of confusion and suspicion. This was no longer a simple, natural death. The rye was a discordant note, a strange, unsettling symbol in a meticulously orchestrated symphony of a life. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in the small village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple was tending to her garden. The phone rang, a shrill, insistent sound that she answered with a calm grace. It was her old friend, the vicar's wife, a fount of local news. "Such a terrible thing, Jane," the vicar's wife's voice crackled over the line. "Poor Mr. Fortescue. At Yew Tree Lodge. Heart attack, they say. But, well, they say. The police are there, and there's a rumour, something about rye." Miss Marple listened, her fingers still gently pruning a rosebush. The word rye was all she needed. It wasn't a clue to her, it was a key. It unlocked a dusty, half-remembered nursery rhyme from her childhood. A rhyme that had always seemed innocent, but now, in this new context, took on a chilling new significance. She hung up the phone and walked inside, a thoughtful expression on her face. A few hours later, she arrived at Yew Tree Lodge. She didn't arrive in a police car or with a grand entrance. She simply appeared, walking up the drive with her familiar, shuffling gait, a basket of freshly baked scones in her hand. Neil, a man who saw her as a kindly, interfering old woman, sighed with weary politeness. "Miss Marple," he greeted her. "A pleasure. We're a bit busy at the moment." "Oh, I'm sure you are, Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "But Mrs. Fortescue has been through a dreadful shock. I thought some of my scones might be a comfort." He let her in, unable to refuse her simple, gracious gesture. Miss Marple, however, didn't head for the parlour and the grieving widow. Instead, she asked to be shown to the study where Rex Fortescue's body had been found. Neil, begrudgingly, led her there, keeping a wary eye on her. She didn't look at the chalk outline on the floor or the scattered letters. She walked over to the tea tray, which had been set aside for forensic analysis. She picked up the teacup Rex had used, holding it delicately. "Such a curious thing, Inspector," she mused, more to herself than to him. "The way the tea has stained the bottom of the cup. It's almost granulated. Not a good brew at all." Neil dismissed her observation. He complained about the tea. The maid, Gladys, made him a fresh pot. "Ah, Gladys," Miss Marple said, turning the teacup over in her hand. "The one who served the tea. A sweet-faced girl, if I remember correctly, yes, but a terrible fear in her eyes when I spoke to her. Didn't she seem to be hiding something?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Her eyes, as sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room. She noticed the slight indentation on the rug where a heavy piece of furniture had recently been moved. She saw the way a curtain was drawn a little too tightly, blocking a view of the garden. But her mind was fixated on the rye. Neil, trying to get to the bottom of the bizarre clue, was interviewing the household staff. He started with Crump, the butler. "The rye, sir, in his pocket. I couldn't say." Mr. Fortescue had many peculiar habits. He was not a man to confide in. What about Gladys? The parlour maid, Neil pressed. What did she say? Gladys is a good girl, a bit simple, perhaps, Crump said, his loyalty unwavering. She was quite distressed. She said she didn't know anything about the rye. She'd never seen it before. Neil moved on to the Fortescue's two estranged children, Percival and Jennifer. Percival, a cold, calculating man, seemed more concerned with the will than his father's death. Jennifer, a flighty, artistic type, wept for a few moments, but seemed more upset about the disruption to her life than the loss of her father. None of them offered a plausible reason for the rye. The more Neil questioned, the more the case seemed to dissolve into a sea of unanswered questions and hidden motives. Everyone had a reason to dislike Rex Fortescue, but a handful of rye. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical detail. Miss Marple, having finished her quiet observation, rejoined Neil. "Inspector, I have just been to the kitchen," she said. "I spoke to the cook, a lovely woman. She told me about the morning tea service. Gladys prepared it, but she was in a great hurry. She dropped a tin of something just before serving Mr. Fortescue. She insisted it was just a tea caddy, but the cook said it made a peculiar rattling sound, like small, hard pellets." Neil's eyes widened. Pellets? What kind of pellets? The cook didn't know, Miss Marple said with a shrug. But she said Gladys was so flustered that she didn't have time to properly clean up the mess. The cook swept it away and didn't think much of it. So the rye came from a tin, Neil concluded, his mind working quickly. But why would it be in the tea caddy? Why would Rex have it in his pocket? And why would Gladys be so scared? The rye. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is not just a handful of grain. It is a phrase, a very old phrase, a pocket full of rye." Neil looked at her, his logical mind struggling to keep up with her intuitive. "Leap, a nursery rhyme?" he asked, incredulous. "Precisely," she said, her eyes gleaming with a mix of sorrow and understanding. "Sing a song of sixpence. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, and when the pie was opened, the birds began to sing." Rex Fortescue, as we know, had a pocket full of rye. "Inspector, I fear this is not an isolated incident. I fear this is just the first verse of a very dark and twisted song." Neil felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The bizarre details, once just a curiosity, now coalesced into a terrifying pattern. The rye in the pocket was not a random act of madness, but a chilling prelude. The curtain had just been raised on a very different kind of murder mystery, and he had a dreadful feeling that the next verse of the nursery rhyme was about to be sung, and he was certain that it would have something to do with the Queen in the parlour, waiting for him in the next room. Chapter 2. The Queen's honey. Inspector Neil stood in the hallway of Yew Tree Lodge. The cold realization of Miss Marple's words settling over him like a shroud. A very dark and twisted song. The phrase resonated with an unsettling rhythm. In his mind, the handful of rye was no longer a bizarre eccentricity. It was the first sinister note in a macabre melody. He had to act quickly to secure the scene and prevent the next verse from being sung. He gave a sharp order to a constable to interview every single person in the house, to not let anyone leave, and to catalogue every item, no matter how insignificant. His immediate concern was Adele Fortescue, the Queen in the parlour from the nursery rhyme. He found her in the drawing room, a picture of fragile grief, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held a brandy snifter. She was surrounded by family and staff, a small, sombre court of suspects. Neil's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. He was a man who dealt with logic and evidence, but this was an act of pure, calculated theatre. Mrs. Fortescue, he began, his voice firm but not unkind. I need to ask you some more questions. About your husband's habits, his will. A soft cough from the doorway interrupted him. It was Miss Marple, carrying a small, lace-edged handkerchief. I've just been comforting Gladys, Inspector. The poor girl is quite distraught. She feels it's her fault, you see. Neil's patience was wearing thin. With all due respect, Miss Marple, I am in the middle of a very serious investigation. There's been a murder, and a second one may be on the horizon if we don't act quickly. Oh, I'm quite aware of that, Inspector, she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that belied her gentle demeanour. The queen in the parlour, as the rhyme goes. But a queen is always surrounded by her court. She is rarely alone. The weight of her words landed with a thud. Neil looked at Adele, then at the silent, watching faces around her. Percival Fortescue, Rex's son, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled impatience. Jennifer, his sister, sat ringing, her hands, her gaze darting nervously around the room. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. No one is to leave this room, Neil commanded, his voice now a low growl. He was about to post a constable at the door when a frantic scream tore through the stillness of the house. It came from the West Wing, from the library. Neele didn't hesitate. He burst out of the room, Miss Marple surprisingly quick on his heels. They found a young housemaid, her face a mask of terror, pointing a shaking finger toward a corner of the library. There, in a her-backed velvet armchair, sat Adele Fortescue. She was not in the drawing-room as they had left her, but here, in the heart of her husband's sanctuary. Her head was tilted to one side, her eyes were closed, and a faint, serene smile was on her lips. She looked as though she had simply fallen asleep, but the unnatural stillness of her body, the faint, sickening scent that hung in the air, mix of bitter almonds and something cloyingly sweet, told a different story. Neil knelt beside her, his professional detachment a wall against the horror. On the small, inlaid table beside the chair was a half-eaten scone, a dollop of honey glistening on its surface. He saw the telltale discoloration on her lips and the faint, almost invisible residue of a crystalline substance in the honey pot. Cyanide. He whispered, his jaw clenching. He turned to the housemaid, who was now sobbing hysterically. How did she get here? I don't know, sir, the girl stammered. I saw her come in here about 10 minutes ago. She said she wanted to get a book, that she needed a quiet moment alone. She didn't look like she had a care in the world. The brazenness of it all was stunning. The killer had walked right past Neil, past the entire family, and had committed the second murder under his very nose. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not looking at the body. She was looking at the honey. She walked over to the table, her steps light and noiseless. She peered at the honey pot, then at the scone, and finally at the jar of honey from which the pot had been filled. How very interesting, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. What is Miss Marple? Neil asked, his frustration mounting. The woman is dead, murdered with cyanide, just as I feared. Oh yes, the poor dear, Miss Marple said with a sigh. But it's the honey, you see. So very specific. Not a store brand, not even a local honey from the village. No, this honey is from a specific apiary, Inspector. A very rare and expensive brand known for its distinct floral aftertaste. It's the kind of honey one would have to go to great lengths to acquire, and one would only do so for a very particular purpose. Neil's mind, which had been racing, suddenly slammed on the brakes. He hadn't noticed the label on the jar. He was looking at the poison, the means. Miss Marple was looking at the honey, the motive, as other officers began to arrive, their questions and movements filling the room with a sense of frantic energy. Neil and Miss Marple stood in a small, quiet island of their own. "You're suggesting the honey is the clue, not just the poison?" Neil asked, trying to wrap his head around her perspective. "The honey is the invitation, Inspector," she corrected him gently. "The poison is just the cruel punctuation mark at the end." The killer knew Mrs. Fortescue's tastes. They knew she would crave a sweet, comforting snack after her ordeal. This was a psychological trap as much as a chemical one. A young constable came over, holding a small notepad. "Inspector, we've checked the alibis of everyone in the drawing room. They all say they were in there when the scream happened. No one claims to have seen Mrs. Fortescue leave. The only person who saw her was the maid who found her." "A perfect alibi, then," Neil said with a bitter laugh. "Everyone in a room full of people, and yet no one can say where the victim went." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room again, taking in the rows of leather-bound books. "The books, Inspector, look at them. They are all organized perfectly, by genre, by author, by height, a most particular library. And your point is?" "My point is that a queen in her parlor, wanting a book, for a quiet moment, would know exactly where to find it. She would not need to wander. She would know the place like the back of her hand. But Mrs. Fortescue did not come here for a book. She was brought here." The implications were staggering. Someone had lured Adele Fortescue into the library, knowing it was the perfect place to administer the poison without being seen. The honey, the specific brand, was a premeditated choice, a deliberate act of malice wrapped in a seemingly harmless gesture of comfort. Neil's attention was drawn to a faint, dark smudge on the spine of a Booker first edition copy of Jane Austen. He ran his finger over it. It wasn't dust. It was a smear of something sticky. "Honey." "She touched the book," Neil said, a jolt of understanding shooting through him. "She came in here, perhaps to grab a book, and the killer was waiting. They put the honey in Whodunit, an irresistible lure. She reached for it, and then ... Then it was over." "Perhaps not entirely over, Inspector," Miss Marple said, a new spark of urgency in her eyes. "Look at the honeypot again. There's something in it that doesn't belong. A very small, almost invisible thread." Neil peered closer. Indeed, nestled in the viscous gold was a tiny, brightly colored fiber, no bigger than an eyelash. It was a motley color, a garish mix of blue, red, and yellow. Miss Marple's face, usually so calm, was now etched with a look of profound concern. "A motley," she said, her voice barely audible. "The motley of a harlequin, the motley of a fool. And who, in this house, plays the fool? The simple maid who felt guilty for a terrible mistake. The maid who was afraid, Inspector. The one who saw something we did not. The second murder was a chilling echo of the first, a confirmation that the nursery rhyme was not a coincidence, but a blueprint. Rex Fortescue's death was for the rye, Adele's for the honey. And now, as they looked at the tiny, colorful thread, the next victim's fate was sealed. The maid, Gladys, was the blackbird baked in the pie, and the killer, still lurking within the walls of Yew Tree Lodge, was not just a madman. They were a meticulous monster, and they were ready to sing the next, and most heart-wrenching, verse of their fatal feast. Chapter 3. The Maid's Motley the Small. Motley-coloured thread lay in the palm of Inspector Neil's hand, a bright garish streak of red, blue, and yellow against the grey lines of his skin. It was impossibly small, yet it held the weight of a life they had just failed to save. The honey jar, now a piece of evidence, seemed to mock him with its sticky sweetness. This came from Gladys, Miss Marple stated, her voice trembling slightly. It's the colour of the yarn she used for her embroidery, a bright, cheerful pattern she was making for her mother. Neil's frustration was a physical ache in his chest. He slammed his hand down on the library table. We knew it. We had the rhyme, we had the clues, and we were still too late. He looked at Miss Marple, his eyes a mix of anger and self-reproach. A killer is still in this house. This place is a slaughterhouse. A frantic search was immediately launched. Every officer on the premises was deployed to find Gladys. They searched her room, the kitchen, the pantries, the staff quarters, every nook and cranny of the sprawling manor. The house, which had been a symbol of static wealth, was now a labyrinth of frantic movements and hushed, fearful whispers. Neil himself, accompanied by Miss Marple, went to Gladys's room. It was a small, Spartan affair, yet meticulously neat. A single crucifix hung over her bed, and on the small dresser, a framed photograph of a kind-faced old woman, presumably her mother. Her belongings were few but well cared for. A small sewing basket sat on a chair, and inside it, a needle with a thread of the same vibrant, motley yarn. She was a good girl, Miss Marple said softly, a look of profound sadness on her face. Simple, yes, but honest. She wouldn't hurt a fly. Then why was she tied to the second murder? Neil asked, his voice strained. Why did she drop something into the tea? Why did she have a handful of rye in her pocket? I don't think she did, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the room. I think the rye was put there, and the poison in the tea. I think she was a victim of a very clever manipulation, a distraction. The killer used her as a pawn in their game. She was a witness. She saw something, and they realized it. A sudden, sharp yell from the top of the stairs pierced the tense silence. It was a young constable, his face ashen. Inspector. Over here. Neil and Miss Marple hurried up the stairs, their hearts hammering in their chests. They found the constable standing in a small, unused linen closet, his hand clamped over his mouth. Inside, crumpled in a corner, was Gladys. She lay on a pile of starched white sheets, her body a stark, tragic contrast to the clean linen. Her death was not a serene slumber like Adele's. It was violent and personal. A rough, knotted scarf had been twisted tightly around her neck, and a wooden clothes peg, the kind used for line-drying laundry, had been clipped to her nose. Miss Marple gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Neil, a hardened professional, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The clothes peg. It was an act of pure malice, a deliberate attempt to humiliate and silence her even in death. Neil bent down, his gaze fixed on her lifeless hand. Clutched in her stiffened fingers was a necklace. It was a cheap, gaudy thing made of plastic beads painted to look like tiny, glossy black birds. It was the blackbirds in the pie from the rhyme, but this time the victim was the bird itself, baked and served with a cruel twist. She was the blackbird, Neil whispered, the reality of the rhyme now a suffocating weight. The third victim, just as you said, and the clothes peg, Miss Marple added, her voice barely a whisper. That's to prevent her from singing, to stop her from telling her story. They began to process the scene, but Miss Marple was not interested in the usual forensic details. She was looking at the bigger picture, the story the killer was trying to tell. The rye, the honey, the blackbirds. Each crime was a performance, a macabre ballet of murder. Neil, however, was a man of facts. He ordered the coroner to the scene and began to question the staff again, this time with a grim certainty. He started with Crump, the butler, a man who had seen everything and said nothing. "Where were you, Crump, when the scream was heard?" "In the kitchen, sir, with Mrs. Fortescue's maid, Mary, and the gardener, Mr. Davies. We were discussing the tragedy." Mary was quite upset. Neil turned to the gardener, a burly, taciturn man with dirt under his nails. "Did you see anything, Mr. Davies?" "No, sir, not a thing. I was having a cuppa. The alibis were all a little too neat, a little too perfect. They were all in a group, their stories mirroring each other. A murderer could have easily slipped away for a few minutes, committed the crime, and returned. Their absence unnoticed in the midst of the chaos, Miss Marple." Her eyes, sharp and observant, walked over to a small window in the linen closet, overlooked the back garden, where a clothesline was strung with a few hanging sheets. A basket of clothes pegs sat on a small stool beneath it. "Inspector," she said, pointing a slender finger at the basket. "That's where the clothes peg came from. It's an ordinary peg, one of many. But the scarf, ... the scarf is not. It's a cheap, synthetic thing, not something Mrs. Fortescue would have owned. It belongs to Gladys." They went back to Gladys's room and, indeed, found a matching scarf tucked in a drawer. The killer had used Gladys's own possessions to kill her. It was a final, devastating act of mockery. She was a witness, Miss Marple reiterated, her mind racing. She saw something that tied the rye to Mr. Fortescue's death, something that tied the honey to Mrs. Fortescue's. But what? What could a simple maid have seen that we missed? Neil asked, rubbing his temples in frustration. Gladys was simple, yes, Miss Marple said softly. But she was not blind. She was in a position to see things that a person of higher station might not notice. She was the one who served the tea. She was the one who was in the kitchen, who heard things, who saw things. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small, worn diary lying on Gladys's dresser. It was not a journal of secrets, but a simple notebook where she had jotted down the day's tasks, small observations, and her daily schedule. Neil, with a gloved hand, opened it. Most of the entries were mundane, but one entry stood out, scrawled. In her careful hand saw the master, Mr. Fortescue, with Mr. Percival in the study. He seemed cross. Mr. Percival was holding a little bag of flour for his baking class. The master laughed and said he had a whole sack of rye. The rye was for the bird feed. I thought it was a joke. Another entry, a few days later, gave them a new lead. Mrs. Fortescue's tea. She wanted it with the special honey from the green jar. She said she wanted to feel special. A lovely new jar was delivered from Mrs. Percival. I noticed the jar was not new. It had been tampered with and was slightly sticky. The honey was all over the lid. The realization hit Neil like a physical blow. The rye was not a clue. It was a distraction. It was bird feed from the garden, a common item that the killer, Percival, had access to. Gladys had seen it and heard a joke that only now made sense. And the honey had been tampered with. The sticky residue was not a new clue, but a warning sign. The killer, who had access to both the honey and the rye, had used them to create a narrative, a clever but flawed alibi. Gladys had seen everything. She had seen the killer with the rye and the killer with the honey. She was a silent witness, a blackbird who knew too much. And in her diary, she had finally sung her song. The chapter ended not with a final scream, but with the quiet, devastating click of a realization. The motive was not madness. It was cold, calculating greed. The killer was not a lunatic, but a meticulous planner who had used a nursery rhyme to stage their crimes. And now, with the blackbird silent, the stage was set for the final act. The fatal feast was upon them, and Neil, with Miss Marple by his side, knew he was finally ready to face the killer head. Chapter 4. The fatal feast. The hushed tension of Yew Tree Lodge felt more suffocating than ever. The rye, the honey, and now Gladys's terrible, final silence had transformed the house into a mausoleum of secrets. Inspector Neil, armed with the evidence from Gladys's diary, knew the truth, but a theory was not enough. He needed a confession, a final push to force the killer's hand. He needed to put the fatal feast on the table. The gathering was Miss Marple's idea. She had requested a small, informal assembly in the drawing room. A little tea and conversation might ease the dreadful burden of grief. She had told Neil, her eyes twinkling with a devious intelligence. And sometimes, when people's guards are down, the truth has a funny way of slipping out. The drawing room, usually a place of light and ostentatious comfort, was now a stage for a final act. The remaining players were all there. Percival Fortescue, his wife, Mary, Jennifer Fortescue, and a handful of the senior staff, including the ever-stoic Crump. Percival sat with a rigidity that belied his casual posture, his face a careful mask of sorrow. His wife, Mary, was a picture of nervous fragility, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy humming just beneath the surface of the room. She passed a plate of freshly baked scones, her quiet presence an unnerving force. "Such a terrible tragedy," she began, her voice soft and conversational. 3 deaths, all so sudden, and all, in their own way, quite theatrical. Percival shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Miss Marple, I don't believe this is the time or the place for such morbid discussion. We are all grieving." "Oh, but I think it is the perfect time," she replied, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Because these deaths are not random, they are connected, like a series of small incidents in a garden. The gardener prunes the roses, the bees collect the nectar, and the blackbirds sing." Jennifer looked at her with wide, bewildered eyes. "What on earth are you talking about, Miss Marple?" "Why, the nursery rhyme, of course," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Sing a song of sixpence. It's a children's rhyme, full of delightful little pictures. A king in his counting house, a queen in her parlour, a maid in her garden, so perfectly charming. But a murderer can take a charming song and turn it into a dreadful, wicked thing, can't they?" Percival's veneer of calm began to crack. "I fail to see the relevance of this nursery rhyme. It's the very foundation of this entire tragedy, Mr. Fortescue," Neil interjected, his voice sharp and direct. He had remained silent until now, a silent partner to Miss Marple's performance. "The rye, your father had it in his pocket. Gladys's diary confirms it was bird feed that you, as the heir to this house, had access to. You had it for the blackbirds, the very birds in the rhyme. A murmur went through the room. The staff exchanged glances, their earlier grief turning to a dawning, terrible suspicion. And the honey, Miss Marple continued, her gaze now fixed on Mary, Percival's wife. The Queen, poor Mrs. Fortescue, was killed by honey, not just any honey, but a specific, expensive kind. The kind you, Mrs. Fortescue, gave her as a gift. Diary says you delivered it yourself, just before the fatal moment. Mary's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was not a conspirator, Miss Marple realized, but a pawn, an unwitting accomplice. The guilt on her face was not that of a murderer, but of a woman who had been used. And the motive? Percival sneered, regaining some of his bravado. What motive could I possibly have? I inherit everything now. My father's death was a boon, not a burden. My stepmother's death, a tragedy, of course, but it hardly benefits me. And Gladys, a simple maid, a nobody. Why would I kill a nobody? Because she was not a nobody, Neil shot back. She was a witness. She was the one who saw you, Mr. Fortescue, with the rye. She was the one who saw your wife deliver the tampered honey jar. She didn't know what she was seeing, but you did. You knew she had the pieces of the puzzle. You knew she had the potential to put them together. The clothes peg on her nose was not just to silence her. It was a desperate, final act of a man who realized his brilliant plan was coming undone. The room was silent. The truth, like a physical presence, settled upon them all. Percival's face, once a mask of controlled sorrow, contorted into a snarl of pure rage. The facade had completely collapsed. "You're mad," he yelled, lunging from his seat. "Both of you, this is all a fabrication. A ridiculous parlor game." "Is it, Mr. Fortescue?" Miss Marple asked, her voice still impossibly calm. "We've found a small ledger in your study. It details your father's finances, not his official one, but a private one. You see, he had been systematically selling off his assets to a secret trust for his wife, Adele, a great deal of money, enough that, had she outlived him, you would have inherited next to nothing. And Gladys, the maid, saw you tampering with the honey jar that your wife had given Adele. The rye was your little game, your smokescreen. The honey was your direct means to an end. Gladys was your collateral damage. Percival was now pacing the room like a caged animal. This is circumstantial. All of it. There is no proof. On the contrary, Neil said, stepping forward, there is proof. We found a letter on your father's desk, written in his own hand, to his solicitor. He had discovered your clandestine ledger, your plan to siphon off his fortune. He was in the process of disinheriting you completely. He was going to expose you. He was going to put a final, definitive end to your greed. The letter, Neil revealed, had been a final, terrible confirmation of Rex Fortescue's suspicions. He had confronted Percival, and that was when the game began. The rye was a distraction, a way to make a premeditated murder look like the work of a lunatic. Percival stopped pacing and turned to face them, his eyes wild with fury. "You have no idea what it's like," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "To live in his shadow, to wait and wait for your inheritance, only for him to give it away to a flighty, useless woman. I was entitled. It was mine, all of it." He lunged for the door, but Neil was faster. Two uniformed constables, who had been waiting in the hall, stepped in and apprehended him. The room erupted in gasps and a stunned silence. Mary burst into tears, realizing the depths of her husband's deceit. Jennifer simply stared, a look of profound horror on her face. The fatal feast was over. The truth had been served, cold and bitter, and Percival had consumed it in front of a horrified audience. He was no longer the grieving son, but the cunning, cruel murderer who had used a children's rhyme to justify his greed. The chapter ended not with a single gunshot or a desperate escape, but with the quiet, devastating click of handcuffs. The killer had been revealed. The game was over, but the case was not. Miss Marple, watching Percival being led away, knew there were still threads to be untangled, motivations to be understood, and a final, quiet epilogue to be written. The blackbirds had sung, the pie had been opened, and now all that remained was the quiet, chilling aftermath. The final truth. Chapter 5. The unseen thread. The silence that fell upon the drawing-room of Yew Tree Lodge was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was not the expectant, suffocating quiet of a pending tragedy, but the exhausted stillness of its aftermath. Percival Fortescue had been taken away in handcuffs, his furious protestations fading into the night. His wife, Mary, was being comforted by a distraught Jennifer. The two women united in the shared horror of their family's betrayal. Inspector Neal stood by the window, staring out at the floodlights of the police cars on the lawn. The crisp autumn air now felt colder, the golden light of the morning a distant, mocking memory. He turned to Miss Marple, who was tidily stacking the teacups on the tray, her movements as calm and unhurried as if she were in her own home. "I can't thank you enough, Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond the long hours. "Without you, I'd still be chasing a madman with a nursery rhyme. You saw the human thread in all of this, the unseen thread that connected everything." "Oh, it's nothing, Inspector," she replied, her gaze gentle. "It's just that I've learned over the years that evil isn't always a great, roaring beast. Sometimes it's a very small weed that grows in the heart, and it's the quietest ones that do the most damage." Neal nodded, the metaphor resonating deeply with him. "He confessed," he said, the words a grim pronouncement. In the car, he was almost boastful about it. Said the nursery rhyme was a brilliant idea. A smokescreen to send us down the wrong path. He knew he'd get a few days' head start before we figured it out, but he didn't count on you, Miss Marple. He didn't count on a quiet, observant woman from the village seeing what a professional detective could not. He was a man of his time, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly. He believed that power and money were the only things that mattered. He didn't think a maid's diary or an old woman's intuition would ever be a match for his cleverness. The rest of the night was spent in a series of quiet, professional actions. Neal returned to the station and later returned to Yew Tree Lodge, armed with the full, devastating details of Percival Fortescue's confession. He sat with Miss Marple, who had insisted on staying until the final, quiet truth had been revealed. Percival's story was a cold, methodical account of his downfall and his desperate, criminal reaction. He had discovered his father's secret ledger, the one detailing the transfer of assets to Adele. The news had been a physical blow, a betrayal that he felt entitled to avenge. He had always seen himself as the rightful heir, the one who had waited patiently in the wings. His stepmother, a woman he saw as a grasping opportunist, was about to inherit his birthright. The first murder had been an opportunity born of rage. He had seen his father's bottle of a rare, fast-acting poison, which the old man had kept for his prize-winning pigeons. A few drops in the tea, and the problem was solved. The rye, he confessed, had been a last-minute flourish. He'd seen a bag of bird feed in the garden shed and had remembered a fragment of the nursery rhyme. He had planted the rye in his father's pocket, a theatrical detail to mislead the police. The second murder was born of necessity. He had needed to cover his tracks and secure the full inheritance. He had known Adele was fond of a specific, rare honey, and he had tasked his unwitting wife with delivering it. He had tampered with the jar, lacing it with a different, more common poisoner, bitter almond cyanide, that he had used in his own small, experimental chemical projects. He had lured Adele into the library, a quiet place where no one would see her. Her death was a clean, calculated act. But the third murder, the one of poor Gladys, was a different kind of crime. It was born of panic. He had seen the maid with her diary, scribbling away. He hadn't thought much of it until Neil's arrival, until the questions began to fly. He realized that Gladys, in her innocent simplicity, had seen the pieces of the puzzle and had unknowingly recorded them. Her diary, a seemingly harmless account of daily life, was a record of his crimes. He had found her, a fleeting moment, alone, and in a fit of panicked rage had strangled her, using her own scarf and a clothes peg to silence her forever. The blackbird necklace, he admitted, was a cruel, final joke. He used his wife, he used the staff, he used an old nursery rhyme as a smokescreen for a simple, ugly truth, Neil said. The finality of it all, a heavy burden, all for the money. All for a few £1,000,000 that he felt was his due. It's always about the money, isn't it, Inspector? Miss Marple said, a look of profound sorrow in her eyes. Not just the money itself, but what it represents. Power, control, a sense of entitlement. It's the same story in a grand manor house as it is in a small village. Neil's phone rang, and a new case, a burglary in the next town over, pulled him back to his world of facts and crime scenes. He stood up, a different man from the one who had arrived at Yew Tree Lodge just days before. He had learned that sometimes the most important clues are not the ones you find under a magnifying glass, but the ones you see in the quiet corners of human nature. Miss Marple walked to the door, her coat and hat in hand. She took one last look at the drawing room, a place now cleansed of its dark legacy. The curtains were drawn back, letting in the faint light of a new dawn. The house, which had been a stage for a fatal feast, could finally begin to heal. Goodbye, Miss Marple, Neil said, a genuine warmth in his voice. I hope we don't meet again professionally, but I would be honored to call on you for a cup of tea sometime. That would be lovely, Inspector, she replied, her gentle smile returning. And next time, I do hope the tea is not poisoned. With that, she stepped out into the morning, a small, unassuming figure walking away from the grand, haunted manor. The story was over. The rhyme was complete. The unseen thread of greed had been pulled, and the entire dark tapestry had unraveled, leaving behind a simple, tragic tale of human folly. The Blackbirds and Rye had found their final, quiet resting place, and the terrible song of murder had at last been silenced.